With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lewis to start with, and she's going to kind of update us on the research that they have done, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so I can see you all, but I can't actually hear anything on your end. So can I get a show of hands for folks that can clearly hear me? Perfect. Okay. So my name is Dr. Brittany Lewis. I'm a research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and I'm really excited to give you an overview of what we are doing at the center and relates to gentrification. So we're doing a mixed methodological research project. The first, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, good. So the first part of the project involved a quantitative aspect. So what we did is we took a number of academics who have developed indexes, and an index, in short, are a number of data points that allows us to determine if a neighborhood is actually gentrifying or not, right? So when I say a data point, I mean, is a community historically low income as a sign of data point? Have the housing prices over time risen, right, in relation to the city as a whole, right? So those are some of the data points that some of these scholars use. So we use those data points to develop a series of maps, which I'm sure Molly might share some of those maps with you. Once we developed those maps, we looked at which of the indicators we used, at least 2 or more indicators in any given neighborhood across the city. Then we looked at those maps to determine which cluster areas would we focus on, right? We interviewed local public officials, neighborhood leaders, just to get a sense of what they have heard their constituents experiencing in relation to neighborhood change, to help inform the maps. So in many ways, the first part of our project was mapping the gentrifiable areas in the Twin Cities. Once we had created those maps, I looked at them to determine which of those neighborhoods would we actually go forward and do qualitative interviews within, meaning how are neighborhood residents experiencing gentrification? It's very important to us at CURA that we use this mixed methodological approach. So we're not just looking at data, but we're connecting how folks are experiencing neighborhood change and data together to give us a more robust analysis of what's happening. Because in some ways, we would argue that numbers don't tell us how people feel, right? Numbers don't tell us how people are experiencing displacement or exclusion, because displacement isn't always physical, right? And unfortunately, I could ask every one of you in the audience what your definition of gentrification is, and you'd all give me different ones, right? There's a nuance to how we're understanding gentrification, especially because we're all positioned differently in the world. So how neighborhood change affects us is different, right? And it's very, very important that we place these two kind of approaches together to get a more nuanced understanding of what gentrification is looking like across the city and in different neighborhoods, because different neighborhoods have different histories, contexts, different demographic realities. So we want to be able to map those changes in a more intentional way. So myself and Molly, my research assistant, who is there with you and will answer more detailed questions for you, have gotten about halfway through our interviews. And just to give you a sense, the cluster areas across the city in north, we're focusing on the Willard, Hay, and Harrison neighborhoods, and south, Powderhorn, Corcoran, Bryant, Phillips West East, and Northeast is Sheridan, St. Anthony West East, and Logan Park. In St. Paul, it's Frogtown, and in the Hamlin Midway area. And we are doing interviews within all of these cluster areas, and we're being very intentional about interviewing folks that are both business owners, homeowners, and renters, and long-term residents. We need a kind of comprehensive sample size across different demographics and different kind of housing characteristics. Where you are positioned, whether it's an ownership or rental, determines how you experience neighborhood change. So we are intentional about reaching out to folks across all demographic realities. So far, we've learned a great deal about what folks are experiencing. There's some common language often used that comes up that I'm sure Molly will share with you. But even more important part of our project is policy recommendations. The goal really is for us to be able to make some recommendations to the City of Minneapolis Community Economic Development Department and St. Paul's. I have met with leadership in both. I've talked explicitly about what we are doing, and I aim to be very transparent in our intention. We are using what folks like you share with us in our interviews to inform those policy recommendations. So a meeting that I had a few weeks ago with some folks at CPED and in St. Paul's Economic Development Department, the series of questions that I asked them came directly from development projects or trends in neighborhoods that folks like you brought to my attention. So in many ways, I needed to understand both the way in which community is experiencing and seeing that change and what the city's intention behind some of that work was. Often there are these disconnects where I think both policy suggestions and solutions can move us toward more inclusive growth models. And that is really what CURA would like this report to help each city to develop a more clear intention around. Many folks would argue that the debate about whether or not gentrification is good or bad is always a central part of this dialogue. And my response to that, and I believe CURA's response to that, is it depends on where you're positioned in your neighborhoods to determine whether or not the growth that's happening in those spaces or places actually is benefiting you. We're all disproportionately aligned in places that allow some to benefit and make it more challenging for others. And I think that's a reality that we need to own. And I hope that this report helps us see the nuances within gentrification, where we can go beyond the question of whether or not it's good or bad, and be committed to more inclusive growth models in general, right? That to acknowledge that there will always be some form of adverse effects when neighborhood change takes place. But if we are intentional about all communities, we can minimize those adverse effects. So that is really our goal with this particular report. We are very intentional about asking the folks that we meet in our interviews, both about what they're experiencing, what they're seeing. Folks are giving notations of shifting rates in their rents, their property values, different forms of code enforcement that are taking place, developments in their communities, the buying up of properties, the flipping of properties in space. Folks are intentional to talk about demographic shifts, whether it's the increase of new young professionals, whether it is the ever-increasing white jogger that is often noted as a sign for many folks of something's happening, right? And those anecdotes matter. Because whether we want to acknowledge it or not, when we're talking about gentrification, we are always already talking about race. Some people aim in these interviews to state it explicitly. Others like to use other language or jargon or terms to describe it because perhaps they're uncomfortable being explicit about what it means for certain people to benefit from a project and others not. And most of those folks are of color. Right? And that presumes that we're all implicated in gentrification. And yes, we are. It is our charge to own that and have open and honest dialogue about what that might mean, but also in a more practical manner. How can policies and practices of the city ensure that all are included in development and change? So I hope I gave you a sense of both methodologically what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why we believe it's important. I want us to get beyond the question of whether it's good or bad, because the reality of it is it depends on where you stand economically, if it's good or bad. It depends on, questions of wealth and other things that might make neighborhood change more lucrative for some than others. That is just a fact. We need to own that politics and decide collectively what we're going to do to include everyone in neighborhood growth. Thank you so much I'm really excited to hear more about the questions that you have. I'm sorry I was not able to be there with you. I'm actually about to walk away to another speaking engagement, but I came on to Skype just to chime in with you before I go talk somewhere else. I really, really appreciate you all being here. Molly can give you my contact information. If you live in any of these cluster areas and you want to go through the intake process to be considered for interview, please contact Molly and myself. We're about midway through the process, and all of your voices matter, and your experiences are what are helping to inform our policy recommendations. So thank you again for coming. And please reach out to me if you would want more information. We hope to have this report done and ready to be released in the early fall, and we'll have a public event. And we want to try to hold kind of everyone in community accountable, for this particular issue, and we'll continue to give you updates on our progress. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for working through Skype with us. We're going to let Molly kind of go through some slides, kind of more of a traditional presentation, and kind of illustrate some of the work that has been going on. You can kind of see it both in map form and a little bit in some summaries of the qualitative information. After Molly's done with that run through, I'm going to come up and just talk a little bit more about the city's comprehensive planning process and some of the work we're doing around housing policy specifically, and then we'll open up to a conversation. Okay, with that, I think we're up to that. So Molly, I'll let you jump into it.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm going to try and not repeat everything that Dr. Lewis just said, but I do want to show you some of these things visually so you can see. Let's see.
And what's your last name, Molly?
My last name is Calhoun. So this gives you a very brief, as Dr. Lewis talked about. We've done some quantitative work. I can't tell you a lot about this, but I'll give you the website where you can get more information. But this is kind of where the quantitative group landed and identified some of these neighborhoods, and these on our website. And then, as Dr. Lewis said, she got together with some other CURA folks and said, okay, where are we going to focus our efforts? We're doing 50 interviews in 5 cluster neighborhoods, so we really felt like we couldn't get to everybody, so we wanted to really refine where exactly are we looking. So as she said, we're looking, and these are a little bit hard to see, but maybe it gives you a geographic understanding. So we've been talking to folks in North Minneapolis and Harrison and Willard Hay, in Northeast Minneapolis, which Dr. Lewis talked about, these and that area, Logan Park, St. Anthony East, St. Anthony West, and Sheridan. South Minneapolis, which she talked about, I think, let's see, Central maybe wasn't on that list, but these are the 6 areas that we're looking at in South Minneapolis. And then we're looking and talking with folks in Frogtown, in St. Paul, and Hamlin Midway, also in St. Paul. So that gives you a sense. So she talked about the main goal of the qualitative work is to see if what folks are experiencing and feeling in neighborhoods matches what we've looked at quantitatively. And so far, as she said, we're 26 interviews in, 8 in North, 5 Northeast, 6 South Minneapolis, 4 in Hamlin Midway, and 3 in Frogtown. And this gives you sort of a racial breakdown of folks we've talked to. And then we're trying to get a mix, as she was talking about. So we're about even right now on homeowners, business owners in these communities, renters in these communities, and long-term residents in these communities. I think pretty early, we started to hear some of the things that she talked about, some rental pressures, some home value issues. She said we've heard a lot about the white runner, to the point where, in the majority of our interviews, when we ask about signs of gentrification, a white runner tends to come up, followed by dogs, different types of dogs, and some other issues. I think one of the other, people are seeing young people, that's another common thing. And then we've talked a lot about new commercial development, breweries, different types of restaurants. So those are the things that we kind of see here across the neighborhoods. But I think really quickly we're like, we're going to have to look at each neighborhood separately, sort of obviously, but because we're hearing different things. People are feeling different pressures. So in North, people have talked about the North Loop and the pressure on Harrison. People have talked about our neighbors coming in to be part of our community, or they're coming in to change our community. In Northeast, they've experienced this boom of breweries. And almost everybody we've interviewed in Northeast has given an example of how Art-A-Whirl has changed and what that's looked like. And people have different perspectives on that, but Art-A-Whirl is definitely something that represents change in the community. In South Minneapolis, I think a lot of people say there's clear change here, but interestingly, a couple weeks ago we interviewed a white female artist who got super teary and cried during our interview, and we said, well, what makes you cry about this? And she said, I just feel so much guilt because I like some of the changes that are happening, but I know I'm the one who's going to benefit. And then in Hamlin Midway, as you can guess, these are St. Paul, but the impact of the soccer stadium, and then they've had some rising conversations about youth behavior, which has been super interesting. In Frogtown, we have the least amount, but we've started hearing, and Dr. Lewis talked a little bit about this, it felt to residents that people are paying more attention to codes and to how people put their garbage out and giving citations and some of those things that they haven't experienced in Frogtown. So hopefully I didn't go too long, but here's contact information for Dr. Lewis and myself. Again, if you're interested in participating in this project and doing some of our intake work as we get around to interviews, please let us know, and I can give this to you afterwards. And also, if you're more interested in how we got here and some of the quantitative processes, if you go to gentrification.umn.edu, you can get a lot more information, especially about the quantitative pieces. So, that's it. Thank you.
I'm sure we probably have questions in talking about what gentrification is and some of the definitions of that. And what we'll do is, in a few minutes, we'll pivot and bring up some of the work that CURA did from some of their slides that are on their webpage to kind of maybe help focus that for a question point. So just pivoting a little bit to we changed our presentation a little around to accommodate Dr. Lewis's schedule. But the city is in the process of doing its comprehensive plan. I'm assuming maybe some of you have heard about it. Have anybody heard about our comprehensive planning process? Great. If you haven't, we have a huge presence out in the front talking about more deeper dives into these issues and other issues. But the city's comprehensive plan is our long-term policy guidance for the entire city. Really more about the built environment and how each of the different city services work within the city. We're legally required to do this plan, as a comprehensive plan, and we must update it every 10 years. It is a really basic set of requirements we have around housing, transportation, service, how we want to grow from a land use perspective, which is really more about wastewater and sewer treatments. But we're taking a much larger look at this because it's important. We want to set a tone and one guiding document that can really help us solidify a lot of our policies at the city. So we've taken a pretty strong undertaking in bringing everybody within the city enterprise, and also you guys today, and other efforts publicly to bring in everybody into the dialogue. We have a steering committee that is made up of the mayor, council members, and other department heads at the city of Minneapolis, and they came up with a vision statement, which is very simple and succinct, but very strong. Minneapolis 2040, an inspiring city growing in equity, health, and opportunity. So what does that equity element really talk about when we talk about gentrification and housing policy? We'll spend a little bit more time talking about it. We also went through this process of developing comprehensive plan values, which are growth, equity, sustainability, livability, competitiveness, and good government. So thinking about it from our topic today, how is a good government, how are we as public employees, how are we as developing policy at the city, help it move each of these other values forward? How do we make growth inclusive? How do we become more equitable? How do we make more sustainable decisions and increase the city's livability? So we've done a lot of breakdown into different policy topics. I won't dive into that. But just to understand where we are in our process, we started this process about a year and a half ago, much more internally. We did this process of big questions in October of this year. I had 2 large focus groups and a lot of community dialogues in October. We reflected information. The information came up. It's on our website. We have copies of that up at our table up front. Again, housing policy is one of the largest things, and gentrification came up as one of those big elements in equitable growth. We are now in this process of starting to draft policy and talk about that today with you guys. We have those, again, some exercises at the table, ability to engage online. Where we are going is that by about beginning of the year next year, we'll have a draft comprehensive plan put together with policies, a policy document that we will then move forward with the city adoption in probably the first quarter of 2018. So again, here are the different methods. So if you feel like you've been sparked by some of these ideas and we haven't quite gotten deep enough into those, we have a lot of different opportunities to engage on this process. One is through these community dialogues, which we're doing today. We're doing with different organizations. We have a meeting in the box. So if you're part of a neighborhood organization, part of a community group, part of just a group of neighbors that want to engage and discuss these things about what these mean, what growing the city means to you. You can download this meeting in the box. It's really just a bunch of sheets of paper on a PDF document. You download it, host the meeting, send us some information. We bring that and summarize that and bring it back into the dialogue. We recognize that a lot of people have the power to engage among their own groups and don't always have to come to all of our groups. As well, we have a digital workshop. We have a digital presence online that you can do some of this survey work on. So the city the city is in the process of developing 13 overarching plan goals. And I'm not going to sit and read these to you today, but I just want to identify a few of the key ones that we've identified that are really important to today's conversation. One is in 2040, Minneapolis will have more residents and jobs, and all people will equitably benefit from that growth. So how do we do that is what we're digging into. We'll have significantly reduced the economic, housing, and health disparities between white people and people of color. These are our defining goals, and we are developing policy underneath that. So I want to just identify a couple of those. We have a lot more we can engage on that. But I also wanted to highlight, actually turn it over to our housing director, Andrea, Brennan, to highlight some of the draft housing goals and policies that we've been developing, and then we can engage back into the conversation about the work at CURA. I'm sorry if this has kind of been a little bit of a jump and a shift, but I hope you can stick with us.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks again. I'm Andrea Brennan, the city's housing director, and I'll be brief, but just wanted to highlight a couple of the draft housing goals that are emerging from this process that Brian just described. These are evolving, and I'm sure that they will continue to evolve as this process continues and we continue to get more engagement and input into this. But these are at this point in time, the draft housing goals that will be part of the comprehensive plan. And the blue, I apologize that it's hard to read, but wanted to point out a couple of the key things that really relate to this topic today. And throughout this engagement process, we have heard so much input and received so many comments that really relate to the topic that we're talking about today. But going all the way to the bottom, I think is really relevant to today, which is to use data and research to inform what we're doing and how we're doing it. So that may seem pretty just basic and logical to all of you, but we think it's really important to just call that out and say that's where we're going to start, is we're going to look at what's happening in our city, and we're going to use data and research and use that to inform our policy development and our program development. And then continue to revisit that as we evaluate those tools. Others, you'll see here a lot of using the word preserve a lot. We have, just looking at housing and housing affordability, for example, we have about 3 times as many rental units, for example, that are affordable to low-income households than we have subsidized units. So, the need to preserve just what's out there in the private market that is providing rents that are affordable to a lot of our low-income residents will be really important. You'll see mixed-income housing because as we are developing more housing, it will be important to make sure that we're including affordable housing units as we develop housing units generally. A lot of discussion around protecting, supporting efforts to protect tenants' rights and improving livability of their home. And then also wanted to point out we have a goal at this point of minimizing the involuntary displacement, specifically of racial, ethnic minorities and vulnerable populations such as low-income households, the elderly, people with disabilities from their communities as they grow and change. So I'll let you read through this. I'll leave it at that, and we're going to move on.